I used to tell myself I was imagining it. Families aren't supposed to feel like locked rooms, especially when you've lived inside the same walls your entire life. But growing up in our small Ohio home, I always felt like a guest who had overstayed his welcome. No one ever said I didn't belong. They just treated me like I almost did. My name is Daniel Mercer, and for as long as I can remember, there was an invisible line drawn between me and the rest of them. My father, Thomas, and my mother, Evelyn, were warm with my younger sister, Caroline. They laughed louder at her jokes. They showed up earlier for her school events. They defended her mistakes like they were accidents. With me, everything felt measured, polite, careful. As a kid, you don't call that exclusion. You call it normal. I remember sitting at the dinner table when I was 8 years old, listening to them talk about Caroline's art contest. She had painted a messy watercolor sunset that bled past the edges of the page. My mother framed it the next day and hung it in the hallway. A week later, I brought home a certificate for scoring highest in my grade on a math exam. My father nodded, told me to keep it up, and went back to reading the newspaper. The certificate stayed folded in my backpack until it tore. It wasn't cruelty. That's what made it confusing. They weren't abusive. They weren't neglectful in the way you see on television. I had food, clothes, birthday presents, but affection felt rationed. Approval felt conditional, and closeness always seemed to stop just short of reaching me. As I got older, the distance became more defined. When family photos were taken, I somehow always stood at the edge. When decisions were made about vacations or holidays, I found out after plans were finalized. They didn't exclude me outright. They just forgot to include me. At least that's what I told myself. By high school, I had developed a quiet habit of observing before speaking. I learned that if I stayed agreeable, I wouldn't disrupt whatever fragile balance existed. My sister thrived in the center of attention. I adapted to the perimeter. It felt safer there, less disappointing. But there were moments that stuck with me, like the night I overheard my parents arguing in the kitchen when they thought I was asleep. My mother's voice was tight, almost anxious. She said she didn't think I should apply to colleges out of state. My father replied that I needed structure, that I wasn't as independent as I believed. The tone they used wasn't protective. It was cautious, like they were discussing a risk. I stood in the hallway, barefoot against the cold tile, trying to understand why my dreams felt like threats. When I finally did apply to a university in Illinois, I didn't tell them until I had already been accepted. The day the acceptance letter arrived, I expected surprise, maybe even pride. Instead, there was silence. My mother asked why I hadn't discussed it with them first. My father said I was impulsive. Impulsive. That word echoed in my chest for weeks. I had spent years trying to be careful, thoughtful, responsible, yet somehow, in their eyes, I was unpredictable, different, slightly outside the frame of what they understood. In college, the distance grew wider. Phone calls were short. Updates about family events came late. Caroline transferred to a school 20 minutes from home, and suddenly Sunday dinners became a weekly tradition. I was invited, technically, but the drive was 4 hours. They knew I couldn't make it regularly. The invitations felt symbolic, like checking a box. I started to wonder if the distance wasn't accidental. I replayed childhood memories with a new lens, the way my grandparents sometimes looked at me with something softer than familiarity. The way neighbors would tilt their heads and say, I didn't resemble my father much. I had always brushed it off. Genetics are funny. Families don't always mirror each other. But the thought lingered. The real shift happened the winter I turned 24. I came home unexpectedly after losing my job in Chicago. The company downsized, and my position vanished overnight. I didn't tell my parents ahead of time. I just packed my car and drove through the snow, needing somewhere steady to land. When I walked through the front door, the reaction wasn't relief. It wasn't even concern. It was alarm. My mother froze in the hallway. My father's jaw tightened like he'd been caught off guard. Caroline stared at me like I had disrupted something delicate. No one hugged me. No one asked if I was okay. Instead, My father asked how long I planned to stay. That question did something to me. Because in that moment, standing in the house I grew up in, I realized I wasn't returning home. I was intruding. The air felt thick with something unspoken. My mother avoided eye contact. My father kept glancing toward the living room, where a stack of papers sat on the coffee table. Caroline excused herself too quickly. And for the first time in my life, I didn't just feel distant. I felt like I had walked into a story that was never meant for me. That night, lying awake in my childhood bedroom, I stared at the ceiling and let the question form fully for the first time. What if the distance was intentional? What if there was a reason I was always kept just close enough to belong but never close enough to matter? The next morning, I decided I was done pretending it was coincidence. And I had no idea that by the end of that week, I would finally understand why they never let me all the way in. The next morning, the house felt staged. My mother moved through the kitchen with mechanical precision, wiping already clean counters. My father sat at the table with a mug of coffee he barely touched. Caroline kept her eyes on her phone, fingers moving but screen dark. No one asked how I slept. No one mentioned my job. It was as if my sudden return had created a ripple they were all pretending not to see. I told myself I was being dramatic. But tension has a sound. It hums beneath silence. And I could hear it clearly. After breakfast, my father said he needed to run errands. My mother offered to go with him, which was unusual. They rarely left together in the middle of a weekday. Caroline disappeared into her room the second the car pulled out of the driveway. I stayed in the kitchen, staring at the coffee cup my father had abandoned. Something in me had shifted overnight. I wasn't the careful, agreeable son anymore. I was 24 years old, unemployed, and suddenly aware that my entire life might have been built on partial truths. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew I wasn't done accepting surface answers. The stack of papers I'd noticed in the living room was still on the coffee table. I walked over slowly, half expecting someone to stop me. The top sheet was an insurance statement. Beneath it were medical records. Names I recognized. Dates I didn't. And then I saw it. A folder with my name printed in block letters. Not Daniel Mercer. Daniel Hayes. The air left my lungs in a single, sharp pull. Hayes wasn't our last name. I told myself it had to be a mistake. A clerical error. Maybe an old document from before my parents married. My hands trembled as I opened the folder. Inside were hospital forms dated 24 years ago. Birth records. Legal paperwork. Adoption agreements. The word adoption stared back at me in clean, undeniable ink. For a few seconds, my brain refused to process it. It felt like reading a script about someone else's life. I flipped through the pages faster, searching for context that would make it less real. There was a name listed under biological mother. Margaret Hayes. No father identified. My chest tightened, not with anger, but with a strange, hollow clarity. The distance. The caution. The careful affection. It wasn't random. It was protection. Or maybe it was fear. I sat down on the couch, the papers spread across my lap like evidence in a trial. 24 years of quiet exclusion rearranged themselves in my mind. The cautious conversations. The hesitations. The way my father looked at me sometimes. Like he was measuring something invisible. I wasn't their biological son. I had never known. And suddenly, every memory carried a different weight. The framed watercolor in the hallway. The folded math certificate. The Sunday dinners I was technically invited to. The guarded expressions when I walked through the door unannounced. They hadn't kept me distant because I was difficult. They had kept me distant because I wasn't fully theirs. At least, that's what it felt like in that moment. Caroline's bedroom door creaked open down the hall. I quickly gathered the papers, but it was too late. She froze when she saw the folder in my hands. For a second, neither of us spoke. Her face told me everything. She knew. How long? I asked, my voice barely steady. She didn't pretend to misunderstand. She didn't ask what I meant. Since I was 10, she said quietly. 10. She had known for 14 years. And no one had told me. The betrayal hit harder than the revelation itself. I wasn't angry that I was adopted. I was angry that my entire identity had been curated without my consent. That every family photo, every birthday candle, every holiday toast had carried a secret I wasn't allowed to access. Caroline stepped into the living room slowly, like approaching a wounded animal. "They wanted to tell you," she said. "They just never knew when the right time was." The right time. I let out a hollow laugh. There is no right time to discover your life has footnotes. I asked her why they treated me differently, why I always felt like I was slightly outside the circle. She hesitated. And in that hesitation, I understood more than I wanted to. "They were afraid," she finally said. "They thought if they got too close, if they leaned on you the same way they leaned on me, it would make it harder if you ever wanted to find your real family." Real. That word landed like a bruise. I wasn't distant because I was unworthy. I was distant because they were bracing for abandonment. The irony twisted painfully in my chest. In trying to protect themselves from losing me, they had never fully held me. In trying to prepare for a goodbye that hadn't happened, they had created the very space that made it possible. The front door opened. My parents' voices drifted in from the hallway. I stood up slowly, the folder still in my hands, my entire understanding of myself rearranged in less than an hour. They walked into the living room and froze. My mother's face drained of color. My father's shoulders dropped, like he had been carrying this weight for years, and it had finally slipped. No one spoke. The silence wasn't accidental this time. It was exposed, and as I looked at them, not as distant figures in my childhood story, but as two flawed, frightened adults, I realized the truth wasn't just about biology, it was about trust. And the next words out of my mouth were going to decide whether this family finally closed the distance or shattered it completely. The silence in the living room felt heavier than the papers in my hands. My mother stared at the folder like it might disappear if she didn't blink. My father didn't look at me at all. He looked at the wall behind me, jaw tight, as if this was the exact future he had spent decades trying to prevent. I was the first to speak. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I just asked them if it was true. My mother nodded before my father could respond. The movement was small, almost fragile, and suddenly, the secret that had shaped my entire life became real in a way that no document could make it. "Yes," she said quietly. "We adopted you when you were 3 days old." 3 days. I had barely entered the world before my story changed directions. My father finally looked at me then. His eyes weren't cold. They were terrified. "We were going to tell you," he said. We never found the right moment." There it was again. The right moment. As if truth was something that required perfect weather conditions. I asked them why they kept me at a distance. Why? I always felt like I was standing just outside something that Caroline was effortlessly inside of. My father sat down slowly, like his legs had given out. "We didn't mean to," he said. "We just didn't know how to love you without being afraid." "Afraid of what?" My mother answered that before he could. "Afraid you would leave." The room felt smaller. She explained that my biological mother had been young, overwhelmed, and unsure. The adoption had been private, arranged quietly through a family attorney. There had been no complications, no custody battles, just signatures and promises. But my parents had always known one thing. If I ever wanted to search for where I came from, they couldn't stop me. They said they told themselves they were preparing for that day. They convinced themselves that if they didn't cling too tightly, if they didn't lean too heavily on me, it would hurt less if I chose someone else later. So instead of loving me fearlessly, they loved me carefully. They didn't celebrate too loudly. They didn't depend on me too deeply. They didn't attach in ways that felt irreversible. And somewhere along the way, that caution became distance. I felt something shift inside me. Not anger. Not exactly. Sadness. Because for 24 years, I believed I wasn't enough. That something in my personality created the space between us. I thought I was too quiet, too different, too detached. But the distance had never been about who I was. It had been about who they feared I might become. My father admitted that every time I pulled away to chase independence, choosing a college out of state, taking a job in another city, it reinforced their anxiety. They interpreted my autonomy as evidence that I was already halfway out the door. So they pulled back first. Not consciously, not maliciously, instinctively. It was self-protection disguised as parenting. Caroline stepped into the room and sat on the arm of the couch. She said she had overheard them arguing about whether to tell me for years. My mother always wanted honesty. My father always wanted certainty. He didn't want to risk losing me to curiosity. The irony settled in slowly. They had feared abandonment so deeply that they created emotional space as a shield. But that shield became the very thing that made me question whether I belonged. I asked them if they ever thought about how it felt from my side. My mother's eyes filled with tears. She said she saw the way I stood at the edge of family photos. She noticed how I hesitated before joining conversations. She said she told herself I was naturally reserved. They interpreted my adaptation as personality. I interpreted their caution as rejection. Two completely different stories built on the same silence. The weight of that realization pressed down on me. Not because it excused everything, but because it complicated it. I wanted a villain. I wanted a clear reason to be angry. Instead, I found fear. Flawed, human fear. My father finally said the thing that broke through everything. "We never loved you less," he said. "We just loved you scared." Loved you scared. That sentence lingered in the air between us. I believed him. That was the hardest part. Because if they had been cruel, this would be simple. If they had rejected me outright, I could walk away cleanly. But they had loved me, just not bravely. And bravery is what I needed. I sat down across from them and let the silence breathe differently this time. Not as avoidance, as reckoning. I told them I had never planned to search for another family. That I didn't wake up every day feeling incomplete. I told them I had only ever wanted to feel fully chosen. Not cautiously accepted. Fully chosen. My mother reached for my hand slowly, like she wasn't sure she was allowed. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel her holding back. The fear was still there, but it wasn't steering anymore. The distance between us had never been about blood. It had been about vulnerability. And now that the truth was finally sitting in the open, raw and undeniable, we had a choice. We could keep loving each other carefully, or we could finally risk loving without a safety net. But risking it meant something terrifying for all of us. It meant trusting that I wasn't already halfway gone. And I wasn't sure yet if they were ready for that. The hardest part wasn't finding out I was adopted. The hardest part was deciding what that truth meant. For days after the conversation, the house felt different. Not tense, not hostile. Just exposed. It was like someone had removed the wallpaper and revealed the raw framework underneath. Every interaction carried a new awareness. Every glance held a question that no one quite knew how to ask. I stayed longer than I originally planned. Part of me wanted to leave immediately, to drive back to Chicago or anywhere that didn't feel layered with memory. But another part of me knew that running now would confirm every fear they had built their lives around. And I was tired of being the symbol of someone else's anxiety. One evening, I found my mother alone in the kitchen. She was stirring a pot on the stove, but her movements were distracted. I asked her why they never told me sooner. Not accusingly, just honestly. She admitted that every year, they set a mental deadline. When I turned 10, when I started high school, when I left for college. But each milestone made the risk feel larger. What if I felt betrayed? What if I pulled away? What if biology suddenly mattered more than history? They kept postponing the truth in hopes that love would feel undeniable by the time I heard it. But love doesn't grow stronger through secrecy. It grows fragile. Later that night, my father knocked on my bedroom door. He sat at the edge of the bed, the same way he used to when I was a kid pretending to be asleep. He told me something he had never admitted out loud. When they first brought me home, he didn't feel instant connection. He felt pressure, responsibility, fear of doing it wrong. He worried that if he made a mistake, it would confirm some invisible narrative that adopted children eventually leave. So he kept a small emotional reserve, convincing himself it was wisdom. "I thought if I didn't lean too hard on you," he said, "it wouldn't break me if you chose someone else one day." That confession didn't hurt the way I expected. It clarified everything. For years, I believed I was on the outside looking in. But in reality, We had all been standing at the edge of something, waiting for the other person to step forward first. The distance wasn't a wall, it was mutual hesitation. The next morning, I asked them something they clearly weren't prepared for. I asked if they had ever contacted my biological mother after the adoption. The question made my father stiffen, but my mother answered calmly. They hadn't. The agreement had been closed. Clean. Final. Then I asked something even harder. If I ever decided to look for her, would they support me? The silence that followed was different from the others. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't evasive. It was afraid. But this time, they didn't hide behind that fear. My father nodded slowly. My mother reached across the table and squeezed my hand. They said they would be scared, but they would stand beside me. Not because they weren't afraid of losing me, but because they finally understood that holding me loosely had already been its own kind of loss. That was the moment everything shifted. Not when I found the papers. Not when they confessed. But when they chose trust over protection. I realized something powerful in that instant. Belonging isn't about blood. It's not even about history. It's about being fully seen and still chosen. For the first time in my life, I felt chosen without hesitation. That didn't erase the years of distance. It didn't rewrite the quiet dinners or the folded certificates. But it reframed them. We weren't a broken family pretending to be whole. We were a scared family learning how to be brave. A week later, I packed my car to return to Chicago. Not because I was running, but because my life was still there, waiting for me to rebuild it. This time, when I stood in the driveway, my father hugged me without restraint. My mother didn't hold back her tears. Caroline squeezed me so tightly I could barely breathe. It wasn't dramatic. It was real. And as I drove away, I realized the title of my life had changed. My family had always held me at a distance. But not because I didn't belong. They held me at a distance because they were terrified of loving me without guarantees. The truth didn't push me further from them. It brought us closer than we had ever been. And somewhere on that long stretch of highway, I understood something that had taken me 24 years to learn. Belonging isn't about where you come from. It's about where you decide to stay. I don't know if I'll ever search for Margaret Hayes. Maybe one day curiosity will outweigh comfort. Maybe it won't. But now if I do, it won't be because I feel incomplete. It will be because I'm strong enough to explore my story without fearing it will erase the people who raised me. The distance that once defined my childhood no longer controls my future. Because now, I'm not standing at the edge of the family photo. I'm stepping into it, fully, without fear,